Okay, I'd like to welcome all of you to the University of Chicago Law School. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Schill, the Dean of the Law School. I am really thrilled to be here tonight and that you're here this evening for this special event. I think I can speak for the entire law school community when I say that we've been looking forward to this day for a long time. Several years ago, as part of the law school's last campaign, and for those of you who are alumni, note I said last campaign because there's always another one coming, Sidley Austin and its attorneys pledged $3 million to establish the Sidley Austin Professorship. Well, the day has now come to inaugurate this chair, and this evening we're going to have the opportunity to do three things. One is to celebrate the establishment of the Sidley Austin Chair and what it means for the law school. Second is to thank the firm, our alumni, and our friends at the firm. And third is to honor Professor Lior Strahilevitz, the inaugural Sidley Austin Professor of Law, and listen to him give a lecture based upon his new book. Now, in the world of law schools, or in the world of higher education, receiving an endowed chair is about as good as it gets. Chairs are awarded only to faculty who achieve the highest standards for academic excellence and scholarly achievement. If tenure means welcome to the club, you belong here. A chair means that you not only belong here, but you have achieved renown. Thus, the endowment of a chair is a special moment in the life of a law school. It reflects, for the beneficiary and the school, a mutual and enduring relationship and a commitment to excellence in the future. Sidley Austin's name will be tied with our law school forever and ever, and vice versa. This couldn't be more appropriate. Sidley, one of the greatest law firms in this nation, has been a very generous and loyal partner of the law schools for a number of years. The firm currently employs more of our graduates than any other law school in the nation. Any other law firm in the nation. As one might imagine, our alumni are leaders in the firm, including Tom Cole, Sidley's chair of the executive committee. On behalf of the entire law school, I would like to extend my warmest and my most sincere thanks to the Sidley Austin Foundation and the more than 50 partners and associates who made a gift in support of the professorship. Our school salutes you and thanks you for your love and for your enduring support of this institution. Now it's my privilege to introduce to you Thomas Cole. Tom is a 1975 graduate of the law school and one of the nation's leading corporate attorneys. As I mentioned a moment ago, Tom is the chair of the executive committee at the firm. In addition, Tom is active in any number of civic institutions. I'm just going to mention two institutions. One is he is completing his term as chair of the board of Northwestern Memorial. And of course, even more importantly, he is a longtime trustee in support of the University of Chicago and a longtime supporter of our school. At one point, I think you even taught at the law school. So along with John Levy, Tom was instrumental in making the Sidley chair happen. And we are grateful to both of these men, as well as to all of you from the Sidley firm, as well as your partners who weren't able to be here today. And now I'd like to invite Tom to come up and extend his welcome to all of you.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. It's even great to be in this room that doesn't hold the most pleasant memories for me. It's probably why I became a transactions lawyer. I speak to you tonight really in several capacities. First, as a representative of the firm, to say how proud we are that Lior has taken the chair that bears our name. So we're very proud of that for reasons I'll go into. Also, as a representative of the USC alums at the firm, and we do have 143 alums of the law school at the firm, to say really simply that our gift is to pay back the school and the university for all that we received from it, even though at the time it may not have felt like a gift. Also, as a trustee of the university, I want to thank everyone for supporting the school and the university. And finally, as a competitor of Kirkland and Ellis, I would like to note that standing here in the Kirkland courtroom is perhaps an opportunity for some sort of exorcism. When Mike called to talk about who might occupy our chair, asked what kind of professor we wanted, and I quickly said, thinking really back to one of my own personal heroes, Wally Blum, I said, we want someone who is a great teacher. And he quickly said, well, that should be Lior then. And we did our due diligence and quickly agreed that he had steered us in the right direction. Now, why was that our first criteria? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, some firms might seek a chair in a particular subject matter that was closely associated with the firm. But we have such a broad practice that we couldn't very well do that. Couldn't even ask for a corporate law professor. On a more positive note, rather than simply that defensive note, our funding of the chair here, as well as at Harvard, Yale, and Northwestern, really reflects our commitment to future generations of practitioners. And they get their start from great teaching. So that's why we wanted a great teacher. And then finally, in self-interest, and I think that's one of the things you're supposed to understand coming from the University of Chicago, we figured that having a chair, having a great teacher bear the name as the Sidley professor couldn't possibly hurt in recruiting. So, the 143 will swell to an even greater number. So I am finished with my remarks because we all really want to hear Lior speak, but my final words to you are that we welcome you to the Sidley family and we embrace you as one of us. So thank you very much.
Well, now is the moment where we get to actually introduce Lior Strahilevitz. To those of you who may not know him, and to those of you who know him, just greet him again. It is really an enormous pleasure and an honor for me to introduce Lior as the first Sidley Austin Professor of Law. Now, I could go on, and I'm fully capable of that for a long period of time, saying all of the wonderful things about Lior that many of you already know. But really, this is his day and his opportunity to talk to you, and I'm going to let Lior's magnificent intellect impress you all without a lot of my comments. Although I will say a few things. It's hard to limit myself because if I were a Sidley attorney, I simply couldn't ask for someone better qualified to fill my firm's chair. The first and foremost qualification for someone in an endowed chair is exceptional scholarship. In just 10 years, Lior has established himself as a star in the field of property law and privacy law. In the legal academy, he may also single-handedly own the field of traffic safety and motorist behavior. And if you can ask him about that during the reception. Lior's work shows tremendous range, which is a trait, a quintessential trait of a University of Chicago faculty member. His articles and now his book shed new and important insights on legal doctrines, ranging from the takings clause to housing discrimination, from intellectual property to property law. The typical Strahilevitz paper or book looks hard at legal doctrines or social problems and then draws insights and connections from fields that are in many ways very disparate, and the impact of all of that is breathtaking. Indeed, his new book, Information and Exclusion, is a perfect example of Lior's fertile mind at work. In less than 200 pages, he applies a theory of information to a bewildering array of doctrinal issues, including exclusionary zoning, housing discrimination, criminal justice, immigration, landlord-tenant law. The book is simply a tour de force, and its insight will surprise you every moment that you read it, every page you go through it, you will just learn more and more. Now, as a teacher, so scholarship is first and foremost. Second, very important for an endowed chairholder is teaching, as Tom said. Very, very important, particularly in this chair. Well, as a teacher, Lior is every bit as outstanding as he is as a scholar. Now, I may be the only person in this room to know this because we don't generally circulate, at least we haven't up till now, teaching evaluation scores for our faculty. But Lior is nearly always, actually always, nearly at the top of the list. He's either one or he's two, year in and year out in the teaching evaluations. And yesterday, I got all the teaching evaluations from the past, 2-3 years, and I read them. And they were pretty voluminous because if you're in one of his classes, you want to say things about him, apparently. So as I read them, over and over again, certain words started reappearing. Amazing, endearing, passionate, hilarious, engaging, brilliant. And then one person called you a Socratic ninja. Now, one of my favorite comments was the following. When my kids go to law school, I'm fairly certain Strahilevitz will be the new Helmholtz, but much less terrifying. He is destined to be a legal all-star. I can't wait to tell people down the road that he was my professor. Lior's teaching earned him the Graduating Students Award for the Most Outstanding Teacher in 2010. Now finally, Lior is the type of person that a great academic institution cannot do without. In the vernacular of one of our most prominent interdisciplinary approaches, Lior is all about generating public goods and positive externalities. In a world of extraordinary mobility among faculty, Lior digs into an institution, digs into the law school to make it a better place. Some people talk the talk about loyalty and commitment. Lior doesn't need to talk. He just does. Whether it's acting as chair of the appointments committee or as deputy dean for 2.5 long years, joyful, hopefully, some of them, he is tireless, wise, and other regarding. This commitment to our school isn't lost on the faculty or the students. When I took over as dean almost 2 years ago, I went around and I talked to a number of faculty members, and I said, I need a deputy dean. I need a deputy dean with wisdom, with heart, with commitment, someone who has the trust of the entire faculty. The response, the immediate response, the unanimous response was Lior. Now, I rely on Lior every day in many different ways for his wise advice and for his enthusiasm, for his love of the institution. So it gives me really great pleasure, huge amount of pleasure and delight that I can introduce to you our first Sidley Austin Chair in Law, Lior Strahilevitz. And come over here. Now, I know none of you can guess what this is. So with one very,
Should stand.
yes, I'm going to just rip it right off. So here is, for all of you to see, the Sidley Austin chair.
It's nice. It's great.
So it says, Lior Jacob Strahilevitz, Sidley Austin Professor of Law, the University of Chicago Law School. So Joanna, do you have a place for this at home, or is it going to stay here? Right.
It'll look great with the dining room.
It's all yours.
Well, thank you so much to Tom and to Mike. That was a moving introduction and an incredibly and overwhelmingly and inappropriately generous one. So I'll only cop a plea that I am in fact Lior Strahilevitz, and the rest of that was terribly overdone. So thank you both Tom and Mike. I'm honored to receive those generous introductions. I'm honored to have my wife Joanna and my mom Rona and my father Meir here in attendance this afternoon. As Mike indicated, I'll be talking about a book that I spent some of the last few years writing, and it's really the three of them and our children who were with me throughout that process, and they were tremendously loving and supportive and patient as I tried to steal away a few extra moments to get another chapter cranked out. And speaking of generosity, everyone at Sidley, with their financial contributions, but more importantly with their love of the law school and their contributions to mentoring our students and teaching here, have been tremendously generous. And I think this chair is just one further example of that. As Tom said, and I adjusted my numbers, Sidley does employ more University of Chicago Law School graduates than any other law firm. And I want to say to the many of you who are here from Sidley, please stay the course. We now have, presently in the law school, a student body that's more impressive than any we've ever had. And so there'll be a great opportunity after the talk during the reception for you to get to know some of them. They continually impress us and make us feel great about the judgment that Ann Perry had in selecting these JD and LLM students. So the last thing I'd like to say about Sidley is that I've taught here since 2002, and so many of my Hall of Fame students have gone on to join that law firm. And so when I think of Sidley Austin, I think of a great law firm, but I also think of all those faces of students who were wonderful in privacy, wonderful in property, wonderful in seminars. And so it's particularly a great honor to be associated with them, to be associated with people like Tom and John, who spearheaded this gift, and also to be associated with my dear friend Eric Shumsky, who's a law school classmate of mine and a partner at Sidley's DC office, and who came in just for this event, which is a terrific gesture of friendship. Okay, so what I want to do is talk a little bit about one of the two principal claims in this book, Information and Exclusion. And then what I want to do is devote the rest of my time to talking about things that aren't in the book, but that I wish were in the book. You know, one of the dangers about writing in an area like information privacy law or law and technology is that everything changes so quickly. And the lead time on a book is such that you have to send it, essentially finalize it and send it to the printers about a year before it finally comes out. And then time passes and you just think, oh, I wish I'd written about this and I wish I'd written about that. So maybe if you'll indulge me, we can sort of treat this lecture as a brief introduction to what I did write in the book, but also as a second edition of sorts. All the things that have happened in the last year or so that I wish I'd been able to write about and that I'm excited to talk to you all about. So the first edition of the book, very briefly, argues that there are three basic mechanisms for exclusion, three basic mechanisms for creating homogeneity. And so to sort of illustrate the dynamics that are at play in the book, I want to walk you through a really awkward and distasteful hypothetical. So let's give it a shot. It's going to ask you to imagine yourself doing something obnoxious. And so let's say it's the 1980s, and you're a real estate developer. And what you want to do is build a community, a residential community that appeals to an affluent demographic of wealthy Caucasians. Now, you aren't a racist yourself, at least you keep telling yourself you're not really a racist, but you're happy to pander to people, white people who'd prefer to live next to other white people if there's money to be made in the process. As it happens, at the time, there was lots of economics research to suggest that Caucasians were willing to pay a substantial premium to live in racially segregated neighborhoods. And lots of real estate developers got rich building neighborhoods that they knew would be racially segregated. Not wanting to be left behind by your competitors, you think to yourself, well, I'll try and give the customers what they want, regardless of any misgivings I may have. Well, one strategy for achieving this obnoxious goal is by acting as a sort of nightclub bouncer for the community. You can decide who gets in, and you can turn away buyers who don't meet the applicable criteria, leaving some prospective homeowners out in the cold. I'm going to call this, I call this in the book, bouncer's exclusion. You're acting as a sort of nightclub bouncer and deciding yourself who gets in. The law, with respect to housing discrimination, gives you some freedom of action. You can always refuse to sell a house to a person you don't like, but you can't do so on the basis of race, or religion, or gender, or national origin. And the Justice Department actually does devote substantial resources to policing the Fair Housing Act, such that it's going to be very risky to flout the law. You can't tell prospective Caucasian buyers, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, everyone in this development will be just like you, because if you do so, there's a decent chance that one of the Caucasians you're meeting with is actually a government employee who will be all too happy to bring a housing discrimination claim against you. Okay. Is there money to be made? Yes. Do you throw your hands up in the air? Maybe, or maybe not. You might get devious in trying to create this homogeneity. Most African American professionals don't want to live in a neighborhood where the majority of their Caucasian neighbors would prefer that they not be there. So you might try and create a focal point using language to make a community, to name a community, to design a community in a way that'll send a subtle signal to Caucasians that they're welcome and a subtle signal to African Americans that they're unwelcome. The book calls these strategies exclusionary vibes, and it provides a lot of historical examples of their use. There's several chapters devoted to that, but just to name a few that are striking, there are real estate developments in the United States called Cotton Hope Plantation or Shalom House. Both of these communities' names send a pretty obvious signal about who might be particularly comfortable living there. All right? But suppose that language is an inadequate tool for achieving homogeneity. Maybe you chose a signal that's too subtle, or maybe peer pressure isn't strong enough to keep the community Caucasian, especially where home buyers might make money by flipping homes. Now you may opt for stronger medicine, something that I call in the book an exclusionary amenity. The idea behind an exclusionary amenity is to embed within the community something that's both costly and polarizing. Ideally, it'll be a collective amenity that Caucasians will be happy to pay for, but African Americans will be reluctant to pay for. And by bundling homes with this costly amenity, you'll achieve your goal of a racially homogeneous neighborhood. The book provides some evidence, although by no means does it prove, that this dynamic may have helped explain the massive growth of mandatory membership golf communities in the 1980s and early 1990s. At the time, there was no mass participation sport in America that was nearly as racially segregated as golf was. In the era before Tiger Woods, African Americans rarely played golf. So if you embedded a lavish golf club in the middle of a new subdivision, you mandated through covenants that anyone who lived in the subdivision had to pay for the golf course, whether they played 0 rounds or 70 rounds of golf a year, you'd likely wind up with a heavily white subdivision. And one of the curious pieces of data that I unearth in the book is that throughout this time, many Caucasian homeowners would buy homes in these mandatory membership golf communities, and yet these Caucasian homeowners played no golf whatsoever. The data raises the question of what exactly they were paying for. If they weren't paying to use the golf course, maybe they were buying something else. Okay? Anti-discrimination law as a matter of positive law, just describing it in neutral terms, polices bouncers exclusion quite aggressively. It produces what I call exclusionary vibes moderately, and it polices exclusionary amenities almost not at all. So there's only one documented case in which the Justice Department went after someone for engaging in an exclusionary amenities strategy that I could discover. That case happened in Falls Church, Virginia, where a real estate developer gave an interview to the Washington Post in which he said, you know, I basically chose these amenities in my condominium complex so that members of a protected group wouldn't want to live here. All right? If you say that, the Justice Department will actually go after you. But going forward, no sophisticated real estate developer is going to make that mistake again. And while I chose a real estate developer in my hypothetical example, I could be talking about any party that controls a collective resource. So the sorts of dynamics, exclusionary vibes, amenities, and bouncers exclusion all play out to varying degrees in workplaces, in universities, in private clubs, in massively multi-user online games, in web forums, shopping centers, and lots of different sorts of communities. In my golf course example, it's largely legal considerations that are prompting a real estate developer's choice of exclusionary amenities. But in lots of other examples that I provide in the book, information asymmetries seem to be driving the choice between bouncers exclusion on the one hand and something like an exclusionary vibe or an exclusionary amenity. My thesis in the first part of the book is that bouncers exclusion gets used in environments characterized by information symmetries, and exclusionary vibes or exclusionary amenities get used in environments characterized by information asymmetries. Let me try saying that now in English. When it's easy for a real estate developer to gauge whether a prospective purchaser has the desired characteristics, then the developer can act as a bouncer, doing the exclusion himself or herself. By contrast, where it's difficult to figure out whether a potential entrant meets the appropriate criteria, then what the person controlling the resource might do is essentially delegate to the people wanting to come in. I'm not going to exclude you because I don't know who fits and who doesn't fit, so I'm going to make it possible for you to exclude yourselves. Essentially, that's what an exclusionary vibe or an exclusionary amenity does. That's really why the book is called Information Exclusion and Exclusion. It suggests that the information environment is often what's driving these choice among different exclusion strategies. Okay, so now I've summarized a good chunk of the book, and now what I want to start doing for the remainder of our time is to update it. There's a historical ebb and flow between strategies like bouncers exclusion on the one hand and exclusionary amenities or exclusionary vibes. My main claim today is that we're moving swiftly into a world where old-fashioned bouncers exclusion is once again becoming dominant, and where exclusionary vibes and exclusionary amenities, which may have played such an important role in the 1980s and 1990s, are receding in importance. And that's because we're living in an era when the pertinent information asymmetries are rapidly disappearing. Okay. That's a claim I'm going to explain and justify over the next 25 minutes or so. And I want to spend most of my remaining time talking about modern-day America. But before we get there, we're going to do a diversion of sorts. I want to talk about 19th century England and then modern-day India before circling back to our own society. Okay? So we like to think of 19th century England as a place without any sort of social safety net aside from the church. But that's an exaggeration. England, as it happens, had a pretty well-developed welfare system in the 19th century, with local government functionaries dispensing cash. Early in the 19th century, low-level British functionaries knew almost everyone in their village. Almost everyone who would come seeking welfare was someone who had known the local government functionary for years. The local bureaucrat knew that Mrs. Butler had 3 kids, was widowed because Mr. Butler had died in a fire, and was deserving of welfare payments. By the same token, the local bureaucrat knew that Mr. Johnson was a drunk, someone who would take any welfare payment and immediately squander it at the local pub. Accordingly, the local bureaucrat could be generous to Mrs. Butler and turn a deaf ear to Mr. Johnson. By the 1830s, though, massive urbanization in England was posing new challenges to that local system for dispensing aid to the poor. In 1801, England had precisely one community with a population exceeding 100,000, London. By 1861, according to the British Census, there were 11 communities with populations exceeding 100,000 people, and London's population had grown to nearly 3 million. Now imagine the effects that urbanization would have on this welfare system. Workers from the countryside were beginning to flood into these growing towns. Laborers in search of work might move quickly from one village to the next. Our local bureaucrat, who was used to a world with no mobility, was going to constantly encounter new people seeking assistance. And how was he to decide who was deserving and who was a swindler? How was he to ensure that the Crown's limited welfare dollars would be spent appropriately? Well, one option was to refuse to give out aid to anyone the bureaucrat didn't know. I'll talk more about that strategy in a little bit, but suffice it to say that such an approach, while it has its merits, gives the local bureaucrat a ton of discretion and almost invites bribery. So England wound up not going in that direction. Instead, in 1834, the British government issued a new mandate. Going forward, anyone who wanted British welfare payments was going to have to reside in a government-run workhouse. The workhouses were basically the modern-day precursors to homeless shelters. At first glance, this was a crazy strategy. Right? The government, which was relatively small, was going to have to substantially grow its bureaucracy in order to run these workhouses and administer them. It was going to substantially grow the government payroll. Giving out cash through local officials mainly just cost you cash, but giving out cash through these workhouses entailed a substantial administrative apparatus. So what explained what the government was up to? To answer that question, we're going to need to know a little bit more about what life was like in these workhouses. In a word, it was crummy. The workhouses were bleak, they were crowded, no booze was allowed, and if you were able-bodied, you had to work for your meals. The only sort of people who would voluntarily agree to live in these difficult conditions and under the state's thumb were people with no better alternatives. If you were a con artist, there was an easier way to make a buck. If you were a drunk, you knew you wouldn't last long under these rules. But for the truly destitute, such conditions were better than the alternatives. Economists Timothy Besley, Stephen Coate, and Timothy Ganane have studied this period in English history and concluded that the shift toward workhouses represented an effort by the British government to simply craft a more effective strategy for dispensing welfare. Faced with information challenges brought about by urbanization, the British government innovated so it could sort its citizens more effectively. We can understand this shift in tactics as a change in exclusion strategies, where the government officials at the local level had lots of information about people seeking government payments. Then it was easy for the government to sort people into two piles, deserving and undeserving. But urbanization created an information asymmetry. Now, welfare applicants had private information about themselves that it would be very difficult and costly for the government to obtain. The government could no longer accurately cut off the undeserving for welfare, and so they created this sort of exclusionary amenity, the workhouse, that would force the undeserving poor to exclude themselves. The British government had to grow its bureaucracy in order to pursue this strategy, but it must have reasoned that the increased costs in labor would be exceeded by the savings from avoiding welfare waste. Now, let's turn back to the modern era. I want to argue that the pendulum that was swinging rapidly to the left in England as a result of urbanization in the early part of the 19th century is swinging just as rapidly back in the opposite direction. Because of the rise of information processing technologies and the decline in privacy, we're experiencing a phenomenon that's the functional equivalent of de-urbanization. our present society, in short, is starting to look a lot more like England in 1801 than England in 1861, at least across a relevant dimension. So to illustrate this trend more starkly, I now want to turn to modern-day India. Although its cities are rapidly modernizing and its technological capacities are developing, India is still vexed by widespread poverty. Approximately 40% of India's citizens live on less than $1.25 a day. Rural India is particularly poor. Indian welfare is still, and this will sound familiar, dispensed in small villages by local government bureaucrats. When I spoke about British welfare in the 19th century, I flagged the possible strategy that a bureaucrat would simply refuse to give welfare payments to someone he hadn't known for a long time. This is the path that India has taken. It's therefore quite risky for an impoverished Indian villager to move from one village to the next, seeking some sort of economic opportunity. The Indian villager's relationship with his local government official is the equivalent of his social security card. In the next village over, where a villager is going to be unknown, he'll simply be refused aid by a beleaguered official who already has plenty of local poor people to worry about. India has approximately 600,000 villages, but many of India's rural poor are effectively trapped in one of them. The opportunities for the state to ameliorate a problem of this nature are limited. After all, India can't build workhouses for 40% of its population. While private sector growth in India has been robust lately, there's little demand for relatively unskilled labor in far-flung areas poorly served by infrastructure. India's poor need to make it to cities if they want to have some hope of upward mobility, yet it's precisely because the move to cities destroys any social safety net that so many of them stay put. And this results in massive labor market dislocation inside modern India. So what's the world's largest democracy to do? Well, the contemporary Indian government has come up with what it thinks is a silver bullet, a program called Aadhaar. What is Aadhaar? It's the world's largest biometric database. Within the next several years, Indian government officials are going to be photographing, fingerprinting, and iris scanning what they hope will be all 1.2 billion of India's residents. Each piece of biometric data will be linked to a name, a gender, an address, a date of birth, and a 12-digit unique identifier similar to American Social Security numbers. This is a very big deal in a society where the rural poor basically have no identities outside of their own villages. In the apt words of Nandan Nilekani, the software mogul who founded Infosys and who's spearheading the government's Aadhaar program, quote, "What we are creating is as important as a road," end quote. A recent New York Times article on Aadhaar began by telling the story of Ankaji Bai Gangar, a 49-year-old Indian subsistence farmer living in a small village called Kaldari. After being fingerprinted and having his iris scanned, Gangar would obtain a transportable identity for the first time in his life. He could now receive welfare payments outside of Kaldari. He could obtain a cell phone in a different town. He could open a bank account anywhere in the country. Right after Muhammad Jalil, one of the other Indians who had signed up for Aadhaar, was fingerprinted and had his iris scanned, he pointed at the Aadhaar computer station and said to a reporter, quote, "That will give me an identity. It will show that I am a human being, that I am alive, that I live on this planet. It will prove that I am an Indian." The ability of government and corporate offices to authenticate Gangar and Jalil's identities is going to finally enable them, so the government hopes, to become full citizens in the economic life of the nation. India's great step forward towards modernity is in many ways a return to England in the early 19th century. Every time the government interacts with one of its citizens, it will know who they are and what they are entitled to. Now this information is no longer going to be confined to a local bureaucrat in Kaldari. Indian banks are going to know whether Gangar has made good on his debts in the past. Perhaps before too long, Indian pharmacies will know whether Jalil has filled his prescription multiple times at different pharmacies. And Indian police officers who pull aside Gangar during a routine traffic stop may be able to detect immediately whether there are any outstanding warrants for his arrest. In short, what India is trying to do is combine the benefits of local knowledge from small villages and limited mobility with the benefits of modernity, the unhindered movement of people and capital, and rights to exit underperforming jurisdictions and firms. In a world like that, the Indian institution that seeks to exclude the unworthy or the undesirable no longer needs to rely on exclusionary amenity strategies. Rather, they've got all the information they need to be effective bouncers. And every additional piece of data they get gives them the ability to exclude or include with greater precision. Okay, now let's turn to contemporary America. To some degree, the changes that Aadhaar will bring to India are a transformation through which Americans have already lived. We've grown accustomed to the idea that credit scores follow us around to a bank or to a car dealership. The Social Security Administration has no difficulty keeping track of people when they move at the age of 70 from Solon, Ohio to Boca Raton, Florida, finally having gotten fed up with the Midwestern winters. And with the long overdue arrival of electronic medical records, even our healthcare information is finally becoming increasingly portable. But the first period of the information age only sets the stage for the sorts of detailed information that vendors are beginning to amass about every individual American consumer. Those of us who study privacy law have come to realize that it's the merging of divergent data sets that provides the most useful information and that's most likely to catch consumers by surprise. So to take an example, Bally's has a large database in which it tracks how often each of its customers have come in to use the gym. That seems appropriate. They've got to figure out how much equipment to buy and how often to maintain it. Blue Cross Blue Shield has a massive database with information about people's visits to doctors and nurses. It's more sensitive, but again, consumers aren't going to object to the retention of this data. Now imagine Blue Cross Blue Shield licenses the Bally's database and uses information about the frequency of gym visits to try and assess the impact of those gym visits on patient health outcomes. That's going to catch a lot of consumers unawares, but it's the merger of these databases that might permit Blue Cross and Blue Shield to identify counterintuitive patterns and to change the way it prices risks. The challenge for privacy scholars and for people who work on privacy issues in industry then is to figure out ahead of time what sorts of databases may combine to produce a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. So looking in our pockets and purses is one place to start. Our GPS-enabled smartphones increasingly keep track of exactly where we go every day, how long we linger at the shopping mall, how fast we drive to work, whether we frequent the gym or the bar or the racetrack. Although terms of service do constrain the sorts of data that wireless carriers can collect, few Americans have objected to what are really quite profoundly intrusive gathering and storage of this sort of information. Just last week, Verizon Wireless changed its terms of service to permit it to sell data on its consumers' location in the real world, the websites they visit on their mobile devices, and their demographic information. Verizon has evidently been collecting and analyzing this information about all of its customers for several years, and now they're going to be aggregating it and selling it in aggregate form to third parties for the first time. Yet consumer complaints about these policy changes have been really muted. Social networking websites, to take another industry, supplement this location information that they're getting from smartphones with rich data about who we know, who we speak with online, what sorts of media content we like, what sorts of celebrities we're interested in, what sorts of games we like to play. And credit card companies have been using data mining techniques to impressive new effects as well. They've long been tracking things like how quickly we pay off our balances and whether we always pay off our bills every month, whether we always pay our credit card bills every month. But now they're branching into much more powerful analytics that essentially merge the functionalities of a credit card with one of those grocery store buyers clubs. The early leader in analytics of this sort was a Canadian credit card purchaser, or a Canadian credit card issuer, which discovered several years ago, for example, that people who purchase felt pads to be stuck at the bottom of chair and table legs are incredibly creditworthy. Apparently it turns out that the same sorts of people who are obsessively compulsive about preventing scratches to hardwood floors are similarly obsessively compulsive about making their credit card payments on time. Just excuse me for a minute. Okay. I won't go through the whole rigmarole, but I feel so much more creditworthy now. By aggregating data from each of these sources and using data mining techniques to find patterns wherever they exist, companies like Verizon and other firms in the wireless industry can piece together consumer profiles that are going to make run-of-the-mill FICO scores look antiquated and incredibly crude. The sort of precision with which these data aggregators will be able to sort populations is unlike anything we've seen before. Even in 18th century villages, it was true that everybody knew everybody, and it was true that nobody ever left the community. But any knowledge that a small town had about an individual was going to be disaggregated amongst a bunch of different people. Whereas now that information is being systematized in databases and aggregated with the click of a mouse. At the same time, rapid advances in facial recognition technology and other biometrics is enabling firms and governments to link up these online identities, all the information in these government databases, with our bodies as they move through space. Crucially, biometrics are permitting people's behavior to be analyzed regardless of whether they know that they're being watched. If you're a Facebook member and you upload a photograph of yourself and other people in the background, Facebook will now suggest names for those people who are in the background of your picture, if they're friends of yours. Now, it's using facial recognition technology to do this. While it doesn't presently suggest the names of other Facebook members who aren't your Facebook friends, it's really only the terms of service that prevent Facebook from doing that, and Facebook will change its terms of service if it thinks that doing so won't upset its customers. Moreover, under Facebook's existing terms of service, there don't seem to be any limitations on Facebook's ability to use the fact that someone who's showing up in the background of your pictures is identified by name. So it might see a picture and recognize Mike Schill in the background at your trip to Disney World, and use that fact to enhance its profile of you and to help it better predict information about what you're likely to buy and your other proclivities. A few years ago, Google's engineers developed an image search feature that would have allowed people to upload a photograph of a face onto Google and then search for any images in the Google Images database of the same person. You'd be using, in short, a photo instead of text as your search query. Google decided to kill off the application because Google employees thought that its potential for abuse was too grave. But the technological capacity is already there. And certain uses of publicly available photographic databases will be relatively uncontroversial. For example, thanks to Megan's laws, photographs of every sex offender in the United States are already basically in the public domain. It's pretty straightforward to grab those photographs, assemble them into a database, and then link these databases to video cameras that are running facial recognition protocols in real time, and which could issue alert notifications whenever someone in a sex offender registry shows up outside a school, a daycare center, or a private residence. That's not there yet, but let me talk about some of the things that have already arrived. Even as we speak, 40 police departments around the country have rolled out the Mobile Offender Recognition and Information Systems, MORIS for short. MORIS is an application that works on iPhones and it's being sold to police departments that captures facial recognition information from anyone within 5 feet. And it can do iris scanning as well, but only with a range of about 6 inches. The biometric information that's being captured by MORIS can then be matched instantaneously to databases of mugshots, or driver's license photos, or passport photos, or even the Flickr database. Some of you no doubt find this stuff to be frightening. At the same time, there is something appealing about the type of technology I'm describing. Once the error rates fall to acceptable levels, then the propensity of police offenders to rely on crude proxies like race and age when they're looking for a particular suspect is going to be lessened. Indeed, speaking more generally, we might expect that as police officers and firms get more and more precise information about every living American, they might rely a little bit less on cruder proxies that go to group membership, things like race and age. And so you'll rely, to tell an optimistic story, more on information you have about the individual and less on stereotypes about a group. But there is an odd sense in which society benefits from racial profiling of the obnoxious variety. It's often when the police unwittingly rough up a beloved minister or an alderman that the public finds out about police brutality. So letting cops accurately and instantaneously differentiate between the bad guys and the taxpayers may be good for taxpayers, but there's a sense in which it might be bad for society that wants to deter the dehumanizing treatment of offenders. Okay, so we may, in short, be entering an era in which something like perfect exclusion is a reality. A store may direct its sales associates to focus their attention only on those individuals whose past behavior and social networking profiles indicate that they're good prospects. Sales associates won't have to ask you if you're just browsing, they'll already know. Banks will be able to tailor their financial products to individual consumers based on profiles of their microbehavior. The idea that there are two classes of loans, prime and subprime, with very limited room for negotiation, that's going to seem quaint. Insurance companies are going to get so good at mining data that they'll be able to price risk for automobile policies, life insurance policies, health insurance policies, minimizing any cross subsidies because they're pricing these policies so accurately based on an individual profile. I don't want to claim that information asymmetries are going to disappear entirely. They won't. There's still going to be spurious correlations that show up in databases and that cause producers to mischaracterize consumers. There's still going to be some people out there who have such quirky tastes and unpredictable behaviors that even these databases can't crack their codes. And consumers may try to opt out of sharing information that they know is going to disadvantage them financially or otherwise. Moreover, some consumers may engage in smokescreen behavior to throw off the entities that are monitoring their behavior. Some consumers may buy up lots of felt pads, reasoning that these things are cheap. They can buy a whole bunch of them and then throw them away unused. Felt pads are so cheap that this might be a good investment for someone looking to secure a mortgage product, but smart algorithms might be able to detect this kind of smokescreen behavior too. If you buy up a bunch of felt pads religiously and then a couple years later pay a contractor to resurface your hardwood floors, may God have mercy on your credit score. Similarly, people can wear sunglasses to thwart these sorts of automated enforcement countermeasures. But the economic phenomenon of unraveling limits the effectiveness of some of these countermeasures. Where people have opted in to broadly sharing personal information, people may assume the worst about those who've publicly opted out. So to the extent that sunglasses thwart some of these biometrics, people may start to look at someone wearing sunglasses in an unsunny space in the same way we presently look at someone wearing a ski mask walking into a bank. One effect of this reduction in the costs of sorting and exclusion is a change in the type of signaling that people are going to engage in. Signaling and exclusion presently go hand in hand, and this is the University of Chicago, so law and economics faculty will tell you that signaling is everywhere. Universities provide powerful signals, with many students selecting schools based on the signal that they'll send to graduate schools or to employers. So-and-so was smart enough to get admitted to Princeton, was technically adept enough to graduate from MIT, was enough of an intellectual to graduate from the University of Chicago. On our own faculty, my brilliant colleague Eric Posner, who holds the chair endowed by the law firm employing the second greatest number of University of Chicago Law School graduates, has used signaling models to explain social phenomena like gift giving, courtship rituals, and shame sanctions in criminal law. And think about all the different times you've seen people obsess about which car they should buy, not because of its horsepower or its cargo capacity, but because of the signal that a particular car will send to the people they know. Should I drive around town in a Beamer or a Hummer or a Volvo or a Mini Cooper? And then even after I've bought my vehicle, what should I hang from the rearview mirror? Fuzzy dice, or a disco ball, or Mardi Gras beads? Some of this signaling is expensive, and some of it's quite wasteful, in the sense that the person who's trying to send out all these signals genuinely possesses a quality that he's trying to convey, but lacks any cheaper alternative method for conveying the information to the world in a credible way. Now, there's a funny thing about signals. They're all public. But in a society where so many of our consumption choices, which were previously private but are now becoming public, doesn't that mean we're moving towards a society of 24/7 signaling? Choices like what books to buy and what places to visit and what people to correspond with and what music to listen to were previously subject to selective disclosure. Today, you can carry around a copy of Information and Exclusion under your arm and convey to the world a sense of good taste and intellectual aptitude. Meanwhile, as soon as you get home, you put this thing down and you grab your John Grisham novel. Tomorrow, you can all go to Amazon and buy Information and Exclusion and send the right signal to all your coworkers. But at the same time, go to the bookstore and pay cash for those pulp fiction novels that you really want to spend your time reading. But soon, your Kindle or your iPad might start paying attention to which books you're actually spending your time with, not which ones you're buying. And it's possible that if you're not careful, it could expose you as a fraud. Now, in Europe, data protection authorities have taken a really aggressive stance towards biometrics, towards data mining in the private sector, and towards data sharing across these different platforms. What was once a transatlantic gap in the way that the Europeans and the Americans thought about privacy has now become a transatlantic chasm. And that's already making comparative privacy law a fascinating subject for academics, and cross-border data flows a really lucrative practice area for lawyers. If there's anything that might make American consumers en masse shun the sorts of companies that are engaged in this data mining, it might be the pressure that 24/7 signaling imposes on consumers. Many people do seem to enjoy their private vices and resent the idea that there should be consequences for those choices. They might be willing to be on their best behavior some of the time, maybe even most of the time, but 24/7 signaling may eventually become so exhausting that people seek out avenues for returning to the private consumption choices that characterized, say, the 1980s. Much of the data that feeds this information economy arises under contract law. A consumer engages in a transaction with a vendor and voluntarily agrees to disclose this information about himself. So if consumers start objecting, or if voters start demanding regulatory interventions along the lines of what we're seeing in Europe, then it's possible that the trend I'm describing towards perfect exclusion might be reversed. Immigration may be the context in which we'll see the most profound changes resulting from these new databases and from biometrics. Thanks to the United States military's very extensive use of biometrics in the field, 1 in every 4 Iraqi men of fighting age and 1 in every 6 Afghani men of fighting age have had their fingerprints taken, their photographs taken, and their irises scanned. This information is almost certainly going to be used to inform decisions about who gets a visa and who gets on the no-fly list, and it'll be used to detain would-be entrants at American borders. The extensive use of facial recognition technology by ICE and by several state departments of motor vehicles is already a reality too. As biometric databases for those admitted under expired visas or those who've previously been deported or those who are ineligible to enter the United States grow, American policymakers are going to be confronted with a politically uncomfortable challenge. Whereas it's now quite difficult to identify those millions of undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States, that's no longer going to be true where biometric technologies are deployed throughout American public spaces. Immigrants are going to have to travel through public thoroughfares to reach their jobs or their healthcare suppliers, and being in those public spaces is going to make them vulnerable to biometric detection. Leaders of big American businesses have long felt that the economy needs a large population of undocumented immigrants. So legislatures have been able to keep at bay populist sentiments in favor of crackdowns on undocumented immigrants. And so politicians might talk about workplace raids or fences at the borders or double electrified fences at the borders, but none of that stuff ever gets done, at least not in any meaningful way. But what's going to happen when the costs of detecting undocumented immigrants becomes so low that politicians can no longer rely on these excuses about the difficulty of tracking down undocumented immigrants? Maybe that's the point at which the United States finally has to move to some sort of temporary guest worker visa program. Okay, so here are my concluding thoughts. If I'm right about the rise of linked databases and increased precision of biometrics, then we're in for some interesting times. Imperfect exclusion and sorting are phenomena that we take for granted. If the social science evidence is to be believed, the increased clustering of like-minded individuals into workplaces and neighborhoods and schools is likely to reduce conflict and enhance the propensity for people to participate in politics and governance. Homogeneity streamlines decision-making, makes it easier to satisfy everyone's preferences. Businesses with better algorithms for predicting how customers are going to behave will have happier customers and higher profits. But there are downsides to all of this homogeneity. One of the invigorating things about lingering in public spaces in urban areas, or being called for jury duty, or going to the Department of Motor Vehicles, or attending the Taste of Chicago, is the chance it gives you to see a broad and representative sample of the people in the community in which you've chosen to live. As professors at the University of Chicago, as students at the University of Chicago, as attorneys at Sidley Austin, our vision of humanity is skewed. On a day-to-day basis, we're spending so much of our time interacting with people who are extraordinarily intelligent and generally quite wealthy compared to the population as a whole. We work in a clinic, or we handle a pro bono matter so as to broaden our exposure to different sorts of people, but those are only partial cures. It's the serendipity of an essentially random connection with other human beings that make urban life both fascinating and potentially threatening. A world in which the costs of sorting people approaches zero isn't a world without serendipitous interactions, but it is probably a world in which they're far fewer. Increasingly, the wealthy, the haves, are going to spend their time in luxury boxes, and the have-nots will spend their time in the cheap seats or maybe even outside of the stadium altogether. And the less time is devoted to these serendipitous interactions, the harder it becomes for everyone to understand their fellow citizens' motivations, to empathize with their problems, and to celebrate their achievements. So that's what's at stake. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Anoop Milani.
I wonder if in the aggregate the increased amount of information that's available on people really is a reduction in their welfare. So economists have known for some time that we can provide information that allows you to translate that into economic rents vis-a-vis people that you transact with. So if I'm a high-risk patient, my insurance company doesn't know about it, then I get to be on the insurance plan. They don't price it appropriately, and so I get subsidized, right? This cross-subsidy. pointed out, can also be true in the housing market and elsewhere. But there is a price at which I'd be willing to surrender that. It's the price that will make me different between the money and the rents that I would have gotten with keeping the information private. And so very often when people give up information, they're getting something in return for it. So let me give you 2 examples. So they're both your examples, actually, which is one of the reasons I'm happy that the iPhone is tracking my whereabouts and things like that. I know that I'm going to lose some privacy rights in the future, but on the other side, I'm getting a lot of search benefits. I'm reducing search costs. I'm able to find products a little better. I'm able to find my friends a little bit better, things like that. So that's one example. Another example actually comes from your India example. So this is a very big biometric program they're trying to implement in India, but they're having a really tough time rolling it out. Less than 0.2% of people have actually gotten it, even though we've been working on this system for 2 years now. And the main reason is because people aren't getting any immediate benefit from getting an ID. And so now what's happening is they're thinking about linking it to ration cards so that people would get their rice allotment, or they'd get their, some sort of welfare benefit immediately from giving this information to the government. So again, they're getting paid before they give up the information. So the question is, if that's happening, do we really worry about this, even if we cared about distribution?
Great. So I'm going to try and really briefly restate the questions and then give you some thoughts. So Professor Milani's question is about whether there's any basis for an intervention here, regulatory intervention, when a lot of these sorts of exchanges, I'll give up private information about myself in exchange for an application that I really like or a product that I really enjoy using that'll have extra functionalities, whether we should worry when people are voluntarily making those transactions. And provides a couple of examples of these sorts of exchanges using things like giving up location-specific information on your iPhone, or the Aadhaar example from India. So I guess I want to say this. I'm not at all hostile to that view, but what we see in privacy frequently is instances in which consumers are being, let's say, very boundedly rational, and where failures of imagination sometimes warrant a regulatory response that we'd otherwise be hostile to. So that's the Bally's example or the healthcare example. It's very difficult for people to anticipate these sorts of data transfers from one sort of industry, or firm in one sort of industry, to a firm in an entirely different industry in ways that might help some of them or harm others. So to the extent that there's a case for regulatory intervention here, and indeed I'm not making a strong argument for regulatory intervention, it would be in those instances in which consumers simply can't anticipate the ways in which their data might be used in surprising ways. That's where I think the case for intervention is strongest. And my view is that a lot of the location-specific information is being given up and will be used in ways that I can't anticipate, ordinary consumers can't anticipate, that'll help some of them and harm others of them. And so consumers are taking a leap of faith. We might want to let them take that leap of faith. Or we might think that there's a basis for a paternalistic intervention that tries to either provide more warning ahead of time, though that may be ineffective, or limit the ability of vendors to take information from one industry and one context to another. With respect to Aadhaar, it is right that the startup of the program has been fairly slow. I think there's a couple of government agencies that have already announced plans to essentially start using these technologies to enable people to do things like open bank accounts. So we're trying to convince, India is trying to convince a population of rural villagers to stand in front of a computer screen and have their irises scanned, their fingerprints taken, and their photographs taken. And while the Times article that I cited quoted people who were very enthusiastic about this, there may be other areas in which that enthusiasm is substantially dampened. So the strategy, as we both understand it in India, is to try and link the provision of this data to things that will make the lives of rural Indian villagers easier. And that's why, especially in the last few months, the Aadhaar program's administrators have started to tell citizens, if you give us your biometric information, this is what we'll give you in exchange. And they're starting to try and illustrate these tangible benefits that I referenced in my talk. There's also talk in India about simply making participation compulsory, right? In the same way that participation in the Social Security system is essentially compulsory in the United States. Not quite compulsory, but the rates of Americans who don't have Social Security numbers are exceedingly small, given how important the Social Security number is. Jonathan.
What level of information collection do you think people are going to tolerate, especially consumers are going to tolerate in the long run? So you're obviously right that right now people are putting up with a lot of information being collected, but it seems as though that might be because the stakes are so small. So I'll let Google scan my email, but that's because the only thing that's going to happen is they're going to put an ad that I might like, or I'll let the grocery store learn what I'm going to purchase, but that's only because the stakes are set a coupon. You know, precisely if companies or the government starts using this information to activate the bouncer's exclusion, you think that people might start looking for alternatives. They might pay cash. They might look for devices that they can read without it tracking how long they've read it, like a physical book. Or they might opt for credit cards that have user agreements that agree in which the credit card will never share your information. So, you know, as the information becomes more useful, more powerful, people may opt out as well. I'm curious how far you think we're going to get before consumers have enough.
So, you know, companies, especially in the technology side. So the question is, you know, how much pushing can firms do before consumers do start to push back? Now, for some of the reasons mentioned, it may be good for consumers to not push back, and it may be bad in other settings. It's hard, I think, at this stage to anticipate everything that's going to happen with this data in 20 years. But I think there's a fair question as to why American and European consumers have quite divergent attitudes with respect to the same sorts of technologies. More broadly, though, firms that compete in the technology domain do compete on privacy protections. It's true that several competitors have sprung up to challenge Facebook, for example, with their main selling point being Facebook doesn't protect privacy, we'll protect your privacy. And they've all failed. Google Plus, you know, it's premature to call Google Plus a failure. That was a big part of what they were pushing as well. But every other startup that's tried to compete with Facebook on privacy terms has failed, even though when Facebook surveys its users on privacy policies, they do find a fair degree of dissatisfaction. So where you've got a network good and a very strong network effect tying people into place, then people tend not to care about privacy that much. Where those sorts of effects don't exist, then people may be willing, if they're truly indifferent, to go with the firm or the product that protects their privacy more. That's consistent, I think, with almost all of the empirical research that's been done about privacy. So Alessandro Acquisti, who's going to be spending time with us as a Becker-Friedman Institute fellow in the spring, has done all the best empirical research into consumer preferences for privacy. And what he finds and what other economists have found is that people are willing to pay for privacy, but only a little. You're willing to pay maybe a 5% premium, but not anything bigger than that. So, you know, the interesting part of this puzzle, just to link up your question with Anoop's, though, is that to some degree, with respect to the information we've already given up, what consumers may want to do is close the barn door after the horse has already left. So it may be the case that for the next 10 years, firms aren't doing anything with data that bugs consumers, but then, having amassed these great data sets, they might start doing things that consumers would prefer to opt out of, but they can't. The data's already in the databases, the consumers no longer have any control over it, and they can't undo all the photos they posted on Facebook or all the places that they took their smartphone. Yes?
It seems to me that we're raising a generation with very low expectations of privacy. privacy. So all the talk about what's going to happen in 10 years, I mean, people who are 18, 16 years old, they have very low expectations of privacy in large measure because of what's going on in the internet. I just, I don't know if there's going to be this great uprising in 10 years, or if it's going to be more.
Yeah. So the question is, the kids these days, they don't care about privacy at all. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. So Chris Hufnagel, who's one of the other great empiricists doing work on privacy expectations, has actually found some senses in which teenagers and young adults care about certain aspects of privacy even more than their parents do. As a general matter, I think our children are growing up in a world in which they're engaging in conduct that would have been very foreign to us, that we wouldn't have dared engage in. But there are senses in which these teens are, in some sense, more sensitized to privacy. And so, for example, teenagers, according to the Hufnagel study, seem to be very concerned about separate circles. They really want to share information with their peers, but want very strong protections against that information being shared with their teachers. And in fact, Hufnagel's results seem to indicate that for teenagers, that's a really salient concern, more salient than it is for our generation. So it's complicated, it's interesting, and again, my work is not advocacy work calling for a privacy backlash or advocating against a privacy backlash. I don't actually have strong normative views about a lot of these subjects. I'm just trying to get a sense of where we're headed and what the effects might be. Yeah, Tom.
So at what point will a law school use data mining in lieu of application?
There was so the question is, at what point will the law school use data mining in lieu of applications? So Tom's referring to an article I think that appeared in the Times yesterday about law school admissions offices looking at Facebook information to try and supplement the materials that arrive in the applications. Look, that's already happening. Not here, for sure, not here, but at every other law school in the country. To some degree, that's valuable. It's valuable in the sense that a law school application is always the most favorable version of a person that they're presenting to a particular audience. And if there's a strong disconnect between that person who shows up in an application and reality, the law school ought to know. So, for example, we've long had boxes asking applicants to disclose any criminal violations, for example, precisely because we want to get the complete picture of the applicant. We may admit a student who has a criminal history. We've done so. But we want to do so with full information, and we want to have a fully fleshed out picture of an individual. So in many ways, it's valuable. Now, the information becomes less useful to law schools when applicants have figured out that law school admissions bodies are potentially trolling Facebook. So just like someone might buy up those felt pads just so that they'll fool the FICO algorithm, someone might create all this content about themselves on Facebook that's not really aimed at their peers, but is aimed at a law school admissions office. Now that has costs, right? To the extent that someone is a member of a subgroup of students and trying to present a new vision of themselves on Facebook, then one's peers might say, Strahilevitz, when did you become such a dork? You don't like classical music. What's going on with that? And one of the funny things about Facebook is there's a Facebook wall where people can comment about content you're posting. And to the extent that people are blowing the whistle on someone who's posing, well, that could be useful to an admissions officer, too, at another law school. The University of Chicago would never do such a thing. Yes, please.
Most of your examples came from democratic regimes that we could assume are generally benign. Are there examples of authoritarian regimes using better and better technology to identify possible dissenters? What kind of repercussions could this new technology have for those kind of regimes?
Terrific. So the question is about uses of these technologies, especially biometrics, by authoritarian governments. I'm talking about England and India and the United States, but what happens when authoritarian regimes get this technology? The short answer is they already have it, and the People's Republic of China has been using facial recognition technology to try to identify protesters and political dissidents who have shown up at rallies. My understanding is the government of Iran has also been using these same sorts of technologies. And England, when it experienced, England is not, by the way, an authoritarian regime, but England, when it recently experienced some widespread riots, essentially used a combination of, England's got cameras everywhere. They've got more cameras in London than any municipality. And what they did is they essentially used facial recognition technology to identify who they could, and then put some of the other videos of illegal conduct up on the internet to try and crowdsource and have members of the public identify people who were engaged in the videos in unlawful conduct. So there's, frankly, lots of potential both for new technologies like facial recognition and not quite as new technologies like crowdsourcing to help the state keep greater track of its people for better and worse. Now, what's interesting about Europe is while they're extremely uncomfortable about, European regulators are extremely uncomfortable with data mining by firms or the use of facial recognition technology by firms, they're entirely comfortable with the use of these technologies by government. And what's actually interesting is Americans' attitudes towards the use of these technologies actually tend to be much more concerned when it's the government using it, and we tend to trust private firms. And you can go back to great comparative work by people such as Jim Whitman, who argued, I think, very persuasively that in Europe, everything is flipped. It's quite interesting. Yeah, please, Adam.
So aside from preferences for privacy, or maybe desire for serendipitous encounters on the individual level, which people might value low or might value high, is there a general societal value in maybe shying away from perfect information and thinking about issues, even in a democratic society, of social mobility, where, we might not want to sort, if we accept that, sometimes you have great people coming from unlikely places, when you have perfect information, are there doors closed to people that might detract from a democratic experience?
Yeah, so good. So the question is, what are some of the other social consequences, particularly negative social consequences that might flow from perfect sorting or something that approaches zero-cost sorting? And the question, mentions a number of them. To what extent is upward mobility constrained by a world in which people from modest backgrounds are scrutinized in the same way that nominees for the Supreme Court are now scrutinized, where everything Elena Kagan ever did seemed to be a fair game for the media and the Senate at the time of her confirmation, or at least that information was available. Nobody would ever look at it until someone was given an opportunity, in which case lots of data could be analyzed very, very quickly. So I think a number of different societal interests are potentially implicated, and other scholars who write about privacy law have done, I think, really fine work across these, tackling exactly the sorts of questions that you've thought about. So, for example, Julie Cohen at Georgetown has done some really interesting work on the role that privacy might play with respect to letting people discover who they truly are. So, Julie's view would be that as a young adult, you've got some sense of what makes you happy and what doesn't, but a lot of what young adulthood is about, adolescence is about, is experimenting with different identities, different hobbies, different sexual orientation, different sorts of friends, and that by tracking all this information, especially for adolescents, we're confining adolescents who have some, let's say, low discount rate to engaging only in the safest behavior, engaging only with the safest peers. And that might ultimately yield a whole bunch of unhappy adults, right? People who did what was safe, not what was experimental, and would have led them to try and live their life in another way. So I think Julie's work helps illuminate some of the stakes with respect to privacy. You know, I think there's lots of other good works that try and think about the effect of reputation scrutiny on people's employment prospects, on their ability to move from place to place, on the weight that employers place on past misconduct. You know, employers tend to, for example, view criminal histories in extremely negative terms, such that a lot of the behavior that we see in the workplace, let's say statistical discrimination on the basis of race, is plausibly accounted for by employers trying to go to great lengths to ensure that they're not hiring people who have criminal histories and who therefore they suspect are likely to reoffend in the future. So you know, basically there's a bunch of really interesting work that tries to explore all the complexities associated with some of these changes. And you know, over the next 5 or 10 years, we can only anticipate that lots of University of Chicago graduates and students will do more work in that vein, because it's a great topic. Are we out of? Okay, so Dean Schill is telling me that it's now time to continue the conversation in the reception that'll take place just outside the courtroom. But thank you so much for joining me and contributing. Thanks. That was fun. Thank you.
You can sit in your chair. Well, now I know all of you will be applying for our LLM program to take a leave of absence from Sidley and come here so you could be taught by someone like Lior. Many of you were taught by amazing scholars, and I hope you'll have the opportunity during our reception to meet some of the faculty and get to know them. Today is really a day of thanking people. Thank Lior for a wonderful talk. Thank all of our alumni and our friends at Sidley for making this remarkable gift. And then I should also thank my predecessor, Saul Levmore, who is sitting here, who did two things that we wouldn't be here today without Saul's great judgment and skill. One was, it was Saul during his deanship that asked Sidley for the chair, and Sidley made that wonderful gift, and we're very grateful for that. But also, it was Saul Levmore who hired Lior, and we wouldn't have him here today without that. So thank you, Saul. Thank you, everyone. Please enjoy the reception.